Hello, everybody. Today we are going to look at Roman daily life. What was it like to live in ancient Rome? How would your life be the same, different? And what would you see change for your freedoms and the rights that you have? So we're going to look through all those things today pretty briefly here. As you're working through this PowerPoint or your notes, if you have them, here is your assignment that you should be working on with this. And so this will be in Google Classroom and analyzing Roman daily life directions for each section of daily life in Rome. We'll try to answer 3 questions. How is this similar to the United States? How is it different? And how have rights and freedoms increased in the United States? So we're going to look at the rich and the poor, citizens, slaves, family life, boys, girls, and education. And for each of those, you'll write down 1 or 2 comments on what is similar to the United States, what is different, and what have we seen change in terms of your rights today, so that you have more rights than they did in ancient Rome. So here we go. We're just going to go over these notes. I'll say a few things as we go along, and you can follow with your note sheet if you have it. So to begin, the rich and the poor, the minority in Rome were called the patricians. And the patricians were the wealthy class. They had the money and they had the power. So a few things with them. A lot of times they'd have a very elegant home in the city, lots of different rooms, different areas for people to live. They may have had a villa in the country, kind of their country escape, their getaway, like some people have a cabin today. They had lots of large feasts. A lot of times they've had entertainment at these feasts. If you've ever seen the picture of the Roman who's kind of reclining and laying back and eating grapes and all those kind of things, that would fit with the patricians. They had exotic foods that were brought into them, things like wild boar and partridge, maybe flamingo or ostrich. And so, not unusual when you think about the rich today. You think about fancier homes and big parties and feasts and fancier food. So that's not very different than what we've seen with the rich and the poor. Obviously, we eat some different things, but not very different otherwise. So that's your first class, the patricians, the wealthy. Now, the plebeians are your poor class, and they are the majority. And this is something that escapes people a lot of times when they think about ancient Rome. They think about the Colosseum and its greatness and all these beautiful things, but they forget the harsh reality that most people were poor. The plebeians were a very lower class. And for them, they lived in tall apartment buildings in the city, which usually had no water, no toilets, no kitchens. If you're going to make a fire, that'd probably be in the streets. If you had to go to the bathroom, you could go in a bucket, but then you maybe throw it out your window or take it down and throw it in the alley between the buildings. You may just throw it in the road. It'd be very disgusting smelling. The buildings were made out of wood, which burned easily. And so these housing areas sometimes saw a lot of fires. Food, you brought up the stairs, and waste was carried down or thrown out the window. That's a nice, appealing image. I always kind of laugh about if you're on the lower floors of these apartment buildings, watch out because it's going to smell. The main food that the poor ate, the plebeians, was grains. Grains were cheap, they're affordable, and I would assume this led to a lot of health problems because you just don't have a ton of nutrients in them. Sometimes grains were not available, and the poor would riot. And to prevent this, the emperor at times would provide free grain and entertainment. So basically, the plebeians have this terrible life where sometimes they can't even get food and they riot. And so the government just says, hey, here's some free food, here's some violent entertainment. Hopefully, this will kind of distract you enough to, prevent you from realizing how terrible your life is and wanting change. So the plebeians did not have that rich, luxurious life. When you think about ancient Rome, don't just think about those people sitting back and having parties. Think about the poor, miserable people in the streets that were sometimes unemployed and a lot of times didn't have the food that they needed. Now, citizenship in Rome, a few things with that. If you're a citizen, you held some basic rights, typically the right to vote, to have a lawful marriage, and the right to a trial. Now, I want to look at 2 of these. Lawful marriage is very important because that means that you and your spouse have legal protections. you and your spouse have legal arrangements that protect you and all that. Sometimes societies didn't have legal marriages, and then if a man died, uh, his possessions may not go to his wife, they may go to somewhere else. The right to a trial, wonderful thing. Very good thing we saw in Rome, and something we obviously continue today. Voting was only for men, so that's obviously a difference. And the plebeians, that lower class we talked about, many times could only vote at the local level. So when it came to that national government of sorts, the empire's government, a lot of times plebeians had very little say in that government. And so while they could have local matters they decided on, that was about it sometimes. Roman citizens could not be submitted to torture. No, torture. We think of torture a little differently, obviously. For us, anything that causes pain for a person is probably considered torture. Back then, it was different. For example, St. Peter, one of the leaders in the early Catholic Church, was crucified. He was hung on a cross to be killed. That was considered torture. He was not a citizen, so they could torture him. St. Paul, another Catholic from the early church, he was a citizen, so they couldn't torture him. So they just beheaded him, cut his head off. So torture is something very different today. Most people would consider having your head cut off torture. Back then they didn't. But they did make a distinction. You're not supposed to be put to certain types of torture if you're a Roman citizen. Their idea of torture just differed from ours. Next up is slavery. And you're going to see with slavery some major differences. So to begin, slavery is not based on race. In America, it was based on race. If you had darker color skin, you could be a slave. It's not how it worked in Rome. People became slaves, because they were prisoners of war. Maybe their country lost a war, and they were brought back to Rome as slaves because of that. Thousands of people had that happen to them. Slaves were often brought in from other territories outside Rome, those kind of things. So a lot of times, it was kind of like we saw with ancient Greece. If you're an outsider, you're captured, or you lose a war, you might become a slave. Not based on race, though. Other times we see people are sold into slavery. Sadly, some families would sell their child, one of their children, into slavery. And the reason for that is they might be doing it out of love. They might think we don't have the food to provide for this child. So if we sell this child into slavery, they'll have a better house and life. Or our children will be able to survive if we have the money from this child. Our other children we didn't sell into slavery. So just sad reality for some in Rome. Slavery was extremely common. You saw it in all different places, in cities, in the countryside, all over the place. A lot of times, as we saw in the United States too, household slaves were treated a little better. That's largely because they're working with your children, they're making your meals, you see them daily, all those kind of things. Excuse me, I have some yawns this morning. But on the other hand, those that were working outside of the house were sometimes treated very brutally. Oarsmen and ships. So if you were rowing a ship, sometimes you were shackled to the ship. And you did have slaves that died when ships sunk because they were literally chained to it and they couldn't get away. Gladiators are a lot of times, kept shackled or in cages until they have to fight. And if they win, congratulations, you get to fight again and again and again until you don't win and you die. So pretty brutal conditions sometimes for slaves. One other thing that's a little different from the United States is while in the United States it was possible for a slave to earn their freedom, it wasn't real common. It was very common in Rome that if you were a slave, you could be freed. Sometimes your owner freed you. Other times, if you had special skills, you could earn some tips from the money that you made for your owner, and you could buy your freedom. And so if you did this, you would become like a low-class plebeian. You become the lowest of the lowest class. You'd be free, but there's a lot of stigma, and you're still seen as that lowest class in Rome. Family life. They felt that family life was important, like a lot of people do in America, obviously, as well. Fathers had absolute authority. I wonder how you feel about this. They owned everything in the house, and they could even sell a son or daughter into slavery. Now, obviously, this changes in time, but originally that's what we saw. And so, fathers, they controlled everything. For sons, you were under the control of your father until your father died. So, technically, as a 35-year-old man, I myself am still under the control of my father because he's alive. You think about that, some people would be under the control of their father till they're 60 years old. So that's obviously a big difference from the United States. The wife ran the house. She was in charge when it came to the home and how the home operated, but her freedom really depended on wealth and status. If the family had more money, she could go out and participate more in society. If they had more money, there'd be more slaves doing jobs. However, if you lived in a poor household, uh, the wife in the house would be in charge of, the children, taking care of the home, cleaning, but also might have to go work in the fields, also might have to help with a business that you had. And so the life for women varied a lot depending on your income and status. Boys and girls. Here's what we have. Boys marry between the age of 15 and 18. Girls marry between the age of 13 and 14. And so once you hit puberty and were able to have kids, you could get married. So real young ages, obviously, but you also see that, the lifespan is a little shorter in Rome. And so that can be a part of it as well. When you don't have the same schooling system as well, there's not as much need to worry about finishing school because you're probably finishing school at a younger age as well. So parents decided who sons and daughters would marry. Think about that one. How would you feel about that? So that's obviously something different than we know today. School itself, there's no public schools. There's no Ellsworth Community School District. Between the ages of 6 and 11, most boys and some girls, depending on your class, attended private schools or they studied from home. So you weren't going to a public school that was provided for you. Sometimes the children were taught by slaves, especially Greek slaves, because they may be more knowledgeable than a lot of the Romans. So it'd be kind of weird to have your slave as a teacher. And a lot of times, only wealthy families sent their students on for further education. A lot of times, they'd study Latin and Greek because the Romans looked highly upon ancient Greece for the knowledge they had and wanted to study that. And they'd also study rhetoric, the art of public speaking and persuasion, and trying to prepare students to be ready for the political world, the world of government, where they need to speak and be able to speak in public. So a few different things we see for boys, girls in school. And so that's what we have for the presentation itself. Remember, this here is what you need to work on and what you need to complete. And feel free to look at that PowerPoint or feel free to look at your notes as you go along with that. So have a great day. And as always, ask me questions when you have them.